Hi, my name is Ken Lowey, and I'm excited to share with you the last class in our series, Escaping the Beast. This fourth class is called Living in the Right Realm, and I hope today to cover four aspects. The first one is just characteristics of living in the realm of God's world. Secondly is just sharing why sometimes we don't live in that world. Third, we're going to cover how do we live in God's realm or His world versus the world of the kingdom. And fourth, I'd like to share some different decisions I've made and different experiences I've had in trying to put these things into practice. So let's jump right into the teaching today and review a few of the concepts that we've been going over in the other classes. The first was that the Jews and early Christians understood that the world was to be divided into two ages. The first was the present age, the age where there was full of suffering, full of sin, division, and death, and a Messiah would come actually to restore the world and heal it from its present existence. So the second age then was to come as a time where there was no sin, there was no pain, there was no death. But then Jesus came and changed the whole narrative. He decided and shared his conviction, God's conviction about what the right realm or God's realm would be when he shared about the kingdom as it was going to be here on earth. He shared some really neat scriptures, but in Matthew chapter 10, he taught his disciples about what this kingdom or what this realm of his would look like. And he shared in Matthew 6, verse 10, he says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And through this teaching, he basically shared with us that heaven would actually come on earth as we lived our lives as part of our existence, and then we would be ultimately in heaven with him once we died. So basically, the Sermon on the Mount then became in Matthew 5 through 7 the standard that Jesus' followers would participate and obey as they put in order God's will as they live their lives in God's realm on earth. So where does that leave us? We are to be his representatives. We're to put Matthew 5 through 7 into practice and show what it looks like to live in love and also live under God's guidance and his rule. But being a foreigner and an alien in this world isn't always easy. As we go through some of the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, it's amazing to see some of the exact teachings and what they look like and how that has to exhibit in our lives. In Matthew 5, verse 7, Jesus taught, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." And I know that's not necessarily how the world operates. I know it's so easy to show fault, to accuse, to cause strife. But we as Christians are to live in his realm, his world, in his kingdom, and show mercy to others as we live our lives. Later, he goes into Matthew 5, verse 9, and describes an aspect that is clearly how God wants us to be. It says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." And this is such an amazing characteristics of someone who's following Jesus. Someone who's actually trying to live in God's world is someone who actually tries to make peace and not strife, is to build bridges and not create wedges between people. And I think that's such an important aspect of being a Christian, is that we be known to be a peacemaker. Further on in the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, 10, verse through 10 through 12, it says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." And I've never learned anything in the world about embracing persecution. But Jesus clearly said that if we're going to be righteous and be examples of him, we are going to be persecuted at times. But in that way, we will actually be living in his kingdom. We will actually know that we're actually living his way if these things happen. Not that we look for those things to happen, but they'll naturally occur as we live our lives. Then Jesus goes on to say, Matthew 5, verse 39, he says, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek as well." And this is a hard teaching. This is a very hard teaching. So when someone who is acting in an evil way creates heartache for us, or treats us wrongly or whatever, we're not to resist that. We're actually to embrace that, in a sense, to show them that we're willing to withstand that. And that's such an amazing example of someone who's living in the kingdom versus how people in the world, as we would live in the world. Another challenging scripture, it says, Matthew 5:44, it says, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Now, I'm not so sure I've ever heard anybody in a political argument that would say, "I'm going to pray for you." Um, and it's hard to even feel love from people when they disagree with us on political issues or just don't agree with us. But when we interact with people that actually are acting and treating us like we're their enemies, we're to love them and pray for them. And that's such an amazing sign of someone who's living in God's kingdom. Lots of other scriptures about this. We could look in Romans 12. There's just so many scriptures that describe the lifestyle of someone who's living in God's kingdom. But the ultimate result of all those things is we'll experience God's shalom. And that shalom is a Hebrew word, and it describes the peace and the wholeness, the harmony and the wellness that exists when we live what Jesus described in John 10:10. He says, Jesus said, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come that you may have life and have it to the full." And I know that when we live and put into practice these scriptures, we'll actually be able to experience God's love, but also really feel a life that's full and an amazing difference from what it would be if we weren't in God's kingdom. I guess the question comes in then, why don't we live this way? And there's lots of reasons, but a couple of them that are very, very clear in how Jesus taught. The first one talks about how the aspect of life in the world comes and takes things out of our hearts. And in Matthew 13, verse 22, it says, "The seed, or the word of God, falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful." And clearly, this is one aspect that really puts us into a place that we um, start thinking about the world way too much. We worry about things. We get embrace or excited about the aspect of making money or doing things. But ultimately, what all these things do is they make our lives watered down in our commitment to God, and many times they make our lives a lot more comfortable. It's easier to really embrace going after things that the world wants us to, and if we attain those things, they ultimately can take us away from God and make our lives a lot easier and a lot more palatable as we live in this life. But God does not want us to do those things necessarily. Another aspect that prevents us often to maybe not live this life is that we are not willing to lay down our lives, not willing to sacrifice ourselves or deny ourselves. And John teaches in 1 John 3, verse 16 through 18, he says, "This is how we know what love is. Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." And, I love this scripture because it's kind of the bottom line. We can't say we're loving towards our brothers and sisters or people in general if we're not willing to do something with it, if we're not willing to put into action and in truth some of the things that Jesus has taught us and really deny ourselves. So there's a lot more we could talk about in this aspect of our talk today, but I just wanted to, just kind of give some conclusions. First off, the values of the empire of this world are not the values of God's kingdom. They're not the same. They do not look the same. They do not show themselves the same. And it's important for us to do some self-analysis to figure out which realm or which kingdom that we're actually living in. If we look at history, we can see there's lots of examples of nations or even people that describe themselves as Christians, but they are more remembered for disrespecting Jesus and his teachings through oppressive actions, through physical force that negated people's individual choice, and laws that oppose God's guidance and principles. This would be worthy of some study. I know I've read some different books and different things that kind of describe that, but it's amazing how when we try to put in those things into practice, often we fail because we don't embrace all of God's teachings. But clearly, the only barometer that clearly defines any country or nation as a Christian nation or Christian is the degree that they act like Jesus. He must be our standard. He must be the example that we follow and what we strive to become. So how do we live in the realm of God? How do we live in his kingdom here on earth? One option would be clearly to withdraw from this world, from our community and politics altogether. But Jesus addressed that. He addressed that in Matthew 5, verse 13 through 16, where he called us to be salt and light. Salt permeates everything that it's applied to. And we need to do that in the same way as we live our lives. We can't withdraw. We can't pull back from what God would want us to be and experiences we're able to live in as we live our lives here on earth. And being a light is really so many things, but in the old biblical teaching, really it was being a people that were marginalized, oppressed, or needy would come to for hope. So when we think about being a light, people that are living that way are attractive to people that are in need, that need hope. And God calls us to be that. So we can't just walk away or withdraw from being in political realm or this world and all the different things that go on. However, we need to give a lot of thought. We need to give a lot of thought and prayer as to how to engage these issues. Although we can't refrain, we also have to get a vision for how we engage politics, how we engage issues of social aspects of our lives. So, and if we don't, honestly, we're gonna have a lot of divisions. We'll have divisions in the church. We'll have divisions in our families. We see that all the time, not only in our own church but in our own families, where we can't talk about certain things because we haven't thought through how to really, in a godly way, engage these issues. The values of the empire of the world and the values of the kingdom are at odds with one another. If we help our world to be more moral, we don't necessarily make the world right with God. And we can get confused sometimes with those issues and how they play out. God is our Father, who doesn't use compulsion, but he gives us the freedom of choice to live the way that we want to live our lives. We can't use politics as a means to force others to comply to an agenda that we might have in our politics. So basically, the two characteristics that model Jesus most in terms of how he interacted with people is how he loved people and how he's willing to sacrifice himself. And those are the defining traits that will enable us to live a life that honors God. So, as we look at all these different aspects, I know I've had to think through for myself, how am I going to put these things into practice? How am I going to live this kind of life in the situations that God puts me in? So let me go through some of the issues that come up in the political realm, and I'll just share with you some of my decisions and actions that I've done over the years. First is abortion. Early in my Christian life, Ann and I, my wife and I, decided to support Ann's family, her mom and dad, who had retired. Ann comes from a big family. She's one of 13 children. And they retired basically owning this big old house that was costing them a lot of money just to, and they couldn't even afford to pay the heating bill. So we decided to buy a smaller home for them so that they could retire into. Upon talking to that issue over with them, they decided to donate their home to a organization in their city in Illinois that supported and housed young and unwed pregnant women. So many women who were supported in their time of need, and Ann's parents were able to live the last years of their life in a way that was, not only comfortable, but it actually gave them a secure living situation. But it was neat how God used our initial sacrifice to be multiplied, and many of Ann's siblings also were profoundly impacted as well as the situation played out. A couple of years later, Ann and I had been really eager to start a family, and we had always wanted to adopt. And we knew this was an obvious way to fulfill our dreams of having a family. So we've been blessed. We were blessed at the time and still are blessed with two amazing children now that they're adults. And we wanted to address the issue of orphans in this way. We've been so blessed, and we were also really encouraged that our Boston church family have had such a conviction over the years that over 80 children were able to be supported to be financially adopted through an adoption fund that our church has had over many, many years. I'm just really proud of our church in terms of doing that. And I'm been really neat to see all these children that were adopted years ago now be adults, and some that are even growing up in our church. In the ancient Roman world, there was a practice that was used in terms of dealing with babies that were unwanted. When people didn't want an infant, they would basically leave it outside to die. This practice was called exposure. And the early Christians' response to this practice of exposure was to take these babies into their homes. This was done with an amazing amount of sacrifices, you can imagine. But it did create a great effect on the Roman world and the civilization at the time. And many historians have credited this possibly as being a major influence in expanding the kingdom in the early days of the church. So maybe we can consider, issues or options like adoption, fostering children, supporting programs that support their care rather than engaging in the political issues that are ever present in our world. A second area that is often in our news that's very politicized is healthcare. And I decided right as I started my practice in chiropractic years ago was that no one would be excluded from healthcare in my office. There would never be a reason that finances would be a hindrance for people to get care. So we always work out financial arrangements that will work for our patients. We also joined every healthcare plan that's available to our city or our state. Many of them are not greatly reimbursed, but it allows people that may have less desirable health plans to come in for care. And so we've continued that practice ever since I've been in practice, 40 years now. And over the last 25 years, I've operated a free chiropractic clinic in a couple locations in Boston. Many other chiropractors participate. It's been great to team up with them. And I've met so many inspiring people who have experienced an immense amount of trauma, lived on the streets, and suffered immensely. But I've been so blessed to develop relationships with many people through the free clinics that I've worked at over the years. A third issue that's been a really hot one over the years in the last year or two or three has been the border wall. And in Matthew 22, Jesus talked about the greatest and second greatest commandment, the first being to love God, and the second is to love your neighbor. And over the last decade or so, I've gone at least a dozen times to Central America through the Hope Worldwide Community Service Brigades to treat people through chiropractic care. And I've developed many great friendships with disciples and their friends and neighbors in Honduras, in Guatemala, and El Salvador. And I've been so inspired by their faith and their generosity and their love. It's really moved me to just feel very connected to them and that area of the world. Many of these amazing people have suffered an incredible amount of trauma and loss. Their love for their families is amazingly strong, but the lack of hope that they've had in terms of providing for their families also has always been just devastating. So when I see in the news issues about people coming to our borders, I think of them. I think of their plight and the hardship that they've gone through, and I understand why people would come and try to just support and provide for their families. So I'm grateful to understand through my relationships why this complex and heartbreaking crisis exists. So it doesn't affect me in the same way that it might had I not reached out and God hadn't provided opportunities to know people in situations in cities and countries like that. The next topic is racial justice. Through my volunteerism with Hope Worldwide, I was exposed about 3 years ago to a class on racial issues at a Hope conference. Because of that, I initiated these two couples to come to Boston to provide a course which was called Carrying Each Other's Burdens, to help understand and learn better issues about racial injustice and how that applies to me personally, and also people that I interact with, and how it can affect our church and our communities. I've learned a lot about myself. some really ugly issues, in terms of my own my own racial bias, my own prejudice, my own ways of condoning things. Um, I've seen the sinful ways that I've thought. I've seen sinful practices that I've had, and over this year, I've been blessed to help create a training program with some other disciples in our church that is now being offered to our elders and their wives. And being exposed and being willing to listen and understand others has helped me so much to appreciate where the love of God comes into play, how Jesus interacts with each of us in unique and in special ways, and how I need to understand better how people live and how they've experienced things, and to be a lot more compassionate and caring, and also just be a better friend to people. So that's been really helpful for me in this area. Policing in communities is another hot button for a lot of political conversations. And I've been honored to support a brother, a great friend of mine, Daryl Owens, who's a Boston City police officer, who started a number of years ago a program called the Boston Teen Police Academy. I'm on the board to help start a new charity with him to expand this program and to bring it to greater amounts of people around, teenagers in the greater Boston area and maybe around the country. This program is a summer program where teens actually come to the Boston Police Department for 6 weeks. They're paid a summer job, about $800 to $1,000 to get a summer job. And they come in and they're mentored and counseled every day by Boston police officers. The bonds that are created between the officers and the teens is amazing. Actually, two of the campers in the past few years have now become police officers as well because of the bonds that were created. And at the end of each year, they have a celebration event that the families and community relationships that are developed come with the teens and have a celebration event with the officers. And it's so cool to watch the interaction and the love and friendships that are developed between the officers and these teens. And I know a lot of healing and peace has been brought because of this program, and we hope to expand it even more. And I've been really grateful to have played a little part in that as well. Another issue is women's rights, and one of the most difficult aspects of this ongoing crisis in Afghanistan has been to consider the futures of many young girls and women. Now, I don't personally have a way of helping that situation. I don't know anybody from Afghanistan, but I have mentored over the last few years many younger people inside and out of our church fellowship. About 4 years ago, I was introduced to a young man named Peter, who's from Uganda. He served with me on some Hope Worldwide initiatives here in our Boston area, and he was a student at Brandeis University. He was taking a course on nonprofit business, and he shared in his first class of this program that he started or was taking, that his goal in taking this class and getting his MBA in this area was to help every woman in Africa get an education. And I thought, what an inspiring man. What a dream. What an incredible dream, all of Africa. So as we got to be friends and developed a closer and closer friendship, he shared with me a goal that he's had to build a library and conference center in his home village in Bwaga, Uganda. Peter himself actually used to walk 90 minutes each way to school through high school and middle school so that he could have an education. This enabled him to ultimately get a scholarship to come to the United States to get an education, and then continue to get an MBA at Brandeis. And he saw and he knows that majority of the children, and certainly the women, especially young girls, have no access to this. So he's wanted to build this library and conference center to help people learn how to read and to develop an education, and also have people come in and speak and learn about different concepts of self-growth. At the time I was getting to know Peter, my father passed away and left my brothers and I in an inheritance, and we discussed how we could honor our dad. One of my dad's biggest treasure was reading, and he read and read and read, his books were his treasure. And So we decided that we'd maybe help Peter with some of the inheritance to help build this library. So over the last few months, this building is starting to be built. And by this time next year, it will be built in Uganda. And we're just excited to see some of Peter's dreams come to reality. I know it honors my dad, but I just really excited. And it just really showed me that we can make an impact. And the greatest way that, honestly, for me, that I've learned to develop new dreams is to meet up and spend time with young dreamers in our own fellowship, people that have amazing big hearts and have desires to impact this world. So I just encourage you to do the same, and maybe God would put some other opportunities in your path. Lastly is the aspect of kingdom compassion. And one of my favorite scriptures that describe Jesus' heart is in Matthew 9:36. It says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And I know we each have opportunities to show this kind of compassion. For me, one relationship that my wife and I have had over the years was with a couple gentlemen. One was Michael and his same-sex partner in marriage named Brian. We'd been friends with them for probably 20, 25 years, known them as friends, and they'd been married for about 10 or so years. And they had a tragic ending to their relationship. Actually, Michael killed Brian. He stabbed him to death. So over the last 10 or so years, he's been in jail. He was convicted of second-degree murder. I visited Michael so far in about 3 different prisons, and has done amazing ways to reach out to him. She has actually brought his mother multiple times to visit Michael in prison. And we've continued our relationship. It's incredibly encouraging for all of us. The fact that he's gay and committed a tragic crime hasn't deterred us from reaching out to him. And I know if we were not disciples, we wouldn't have done this. We wouldn't have had the heart to do this. And so I'm grateful, regardless of the circumstance, to reach out to someone who doesn't share the same convictions I about sexuality, who has done something really extreme. But he's going to be out in a few years, and I'm excited. I hopefully played a little part in giving him hope as he looks forward to his future. So in conclusion, I just want to cover a few things here, just that, just to reinforce that the values that our empire in this world have are not the values in our own kingdom. Helping the world to be more moral will not help the world to be right with God. If we're going to model Jesus, the characteristics that we need to show in our lives are love and self-sacrifice. And that needs to be our defining traits to live a life that honors God. We need to give a lot of thought and prayer to how we can engage with political issues that exist in our society. We can't just push it aside. We can't refrain from these issues, but we have to develop a clear vision how to engage these things so that we can be a salt and a light as we live our lives and serve in the ways that God would want us to. Lastly, let's resolve to live in God's realm, in his kingdom, while we live on earth, and live and to really look forward to the realm that we're going to live in heaven with God in the future. So I have a couple of discussion questions just to leave with you. Hopefully you'll share these with others in your group. First off, do you build a bridge or do you drive a wedge? Are you someone who people would look at in the fellowship or in your life, period, as someone who actually makes connections, builds bridges? Or do you drive wedges between people and yourself and others? Secondly, can you discuss issues of politics with a spirit of understanding? Not trying to win the conversation, but being willing to listen to others' opinions and points of view and engaging in a peaceful way. Third question, are you known more for your political perspective or your Christ-like lifestyle? I know that's going to be a question for all of us as we live our lives in this world. And lastly, I'll just share this. I've shared some of my opportunities and some of God's opportunities He's blessed me with. But how could you personally take action to address a social issue with political overtones in a way that would model Jesus' attitude? I know God gives us all different opportunities, So let's take, maybe time of reflection and think through these things. Hopefully you have some good discussions with your friends and your brothers, sisters in your groups. And I just thank you for the opportunity to listen to this. I hope it's been a little bit helpful. And I thank you for the chance to share these things. And God bless you.